coming in, right, is the weather. Oh, yes, Guy, what's up?
Okay, just recording the phone call project?
Yes, so if it's a phone call, you're welcome to record that and transcribe that for the assignment. So it could be through the phone, right? It could be through Zoom, it could be face-to-face, whatever is easiest and most comfortable for you and the other person. Question? So, I wanted to make a mention to the weather since, again, I know things were a little bit treacherous for some of you coming up, especially if you were driving to campus. So in general, I try to follow along with the university. So the university has the website as well as a phone number that you can do to check in about weather and if there's closures for the day. I generally follow that unless there's some type of emergency. But if you're not able to make it safely, then you're welcome, again, to use the video and makeup assignment. I don't want you to have to come up here if it's not safe for you to do so, or where you're living, it's a little too treacherous for you. So if this week or on the final day, you feel like you're not able to come up safely, please do what you need to take care of yourself, and you can use the makeup assignment in those situations. So I appreciate you coming in and navigating this fun weather. Again, for some of you, I know this is kind of par for the course, but for others, this might be your first time dealing with that. So I generally follow along with the university, but I'm really flexible if you're not able to come up for safety reasons and need to do makeup work. So for this week, I want to transition into communication in the workplace. So we've been talking about communication in a lot of applied ways so far in the class, such as looking at relationships romantically, with friends. We were talking last Friday about sibling and marriage relationships and some of the ways that those pose some unique challenges and constraints. So this Wednesday and Friday, we'll be looking more toward the dark side of interpersonal communication. So issues such as aggression, bullying, and those types of things. Again, kind of a dark note to end on, but a way for us to think about a little bit more of some of these ideas. This is our last Monday, so we are really close to the end. It's our last full week. So thank you all for, again, braving this weather and joining us in our last full week of the quarter. As a reminder, in about 4 days, the extra credit opportunity is due. So extra credit, again, adds 20 points or 2% onto your grade. The guidelines for that assignment are on Canvas. Since it's extra credit, want it by that date, and I'm not, outside of an emergency, going to accept that assignment late, but that, again, is your major opportunity to get extra points. So if you're saying, hey, I'm on the verge of passing or not, or I'm really close to the grade that I want, and I'm not quite there, extra credit's a great way to do that. Extra credit has saved people in the past who were kind of on the border, so I definitely recommend doing that and reaching out to me if you need any help for that assignment. Also, as a reminder, I did a kind of poll and touch base with a lot of you about your availability for the final exam date. Remember that we don't have a formal final exam that's cumulative or built on anything from the course. We don't have that, but we do have that 2-hour block as a chance to share your final paper. So you might not be quite done with that by the point we get to on the 15th. But it's a chance to share, to decompress, to talk about the process, and to pose any remaining questions that you have on that assignment. So I recommend coming in with any remaining questions or things that you need help on, as well as coming in and sharing the conversation and what that process looks like for you. So you should definitely have your conversation done and transcribed by the 15th. So it's more of a phase where you're working on some of the content of the essay itself. And then that final assignment will be due by midnight on the 16th. Please try to get that in as soon as you can and let me know if you're not able to get that in on time. The reason for that is I try to turn around grades, your final grades in the course, as quickly as possible. So that helps me to make sure that I can get grades for everybody entered in by that point. Another reminder, I mentioned a little bit last week, you should have received an email about instructor course evaluations. Please complete those if you haven't done so already. Those are super helpful for me to know what went well, some of the things that I can tinker or change. So please do that if you haven't already done so. So we also talked about discussion leading. Again, all of your discussion leading sessions have been graded and have feedback from me on those. Let me know if you have specific questions or concerns. You might look back to the slides on Friday where we talked about some of the things I noticed that went well and things to keep working on for similar types of presentations. And then we talked about family communication, particularly in sibling and marriage relationships, and some of the unique challenges that those things pose. For today, we'll be looking at an application for communication in the workplace and some of the ways that many of you might already, through things like in jobs or internships or other things, be using communication in this way, and also tips to think about how you might apply some of the skills that you've thought through in this class to other work contexts too. So if you find that for your essay you want to engage with a coworker or somebody that's involved in a more professional way, this would be really great resources that you can use there. Before we get started, does anybody have any questions about anything that we've talked about, the final week of the quarter, or anything else related to the class? Again, the 15th from 8 to 10 will be our final exam meeting time where we will have the chance to chat. I'm asking you to do kind of a short, informal presentation of your progress on your essay. What did you choose for your conversation? How did it go? And so on. If you're not able to do that face-to-face, I'll have a Zoom link. If you're not able to do it through the Zoom link, I'll ask that you send kind of a 4 or 5 minute video before class starts that goes over that process for you. And completing that is a requirement toward your attendance, participation, and credit for the course. Again, I've kind of gone through this a lot, but if you need any additional help on this assignment, such as feedback on a rough draft and so on, let me know. I've had a couple people who have sent me transcriptions and kind of wanted to know how those went, and overall, transcriptions have looked pretty good. So it should be 15 to 20 minutes, and it is a total of 250 points. So I want to transition into talking about interpersonal communication in the workplace, which is something that we see a lot if you've ever watched a TV show like The Office or Parks and Rec, but also something that I think really impacts our lives and impacts many elements of our future, right? So interpersonal communication at work is not just about the ways that you might go about to communicate when you're working with other people in a professional capacity, but it's the way that we engage respectfully with other people on a regular day-to-day basis, right? I think that a lot of the ways that our interpersonal communication in the workplace have changed have been a pretty big deal, right? One of the biggest changes that we've noticed over the past year and a half is the shift to more online and remote forms of going to work, commuting, and that type of thing. So, as a result of that, I think that there are a lot of somewhat outdated approaches to communication in the workplace, such as the ways that people would have regular communication in an office cubicle and so on. It's not always the same in this day and age. But nevertheless, there is a pretty significant chunk of our lives that we all dedicate toward our jobs and toward work, right? In fact, generally speaking, in an average day for an average working adult in the United States, it's generally about 9 hours of our day that we might dedicate toward work and toward work-related activities. I'm going to fix the slide for you. So, and there's a lot of ways that that's shifted. One might think that as a result of COVID and a lot of work moving remotely, that number and ratio would go down, but in a lot of situations it's gone up because work has crept into a lot of other elements of our lives, such as answering emails, participating in meetings, and so on. That is, oftentimes we really feel on in a way that we might not have if we went to work face-to-face. So if you kind of felt like, if you were taking classes that were offered remotely, that it was stressful or challenging in a unique way, that's oftentimes because your place of work was very different in the past, or your place that you went to school was very different from where you would do things like eat, take care of yourself, and so on. And by putting those two things together, it created this really blurry line between those things and oftentimes made that experience a lot more stressful. So our communication at work, right, has changed in a lot of ways, and it's a way of thinking about some of these ideas in a unique way. So more remote work has meant that there's a lot more correspondence through things like email, but also through using things like Zoom, Google Hangouts, especially if there's team-related work that you might be doing for your job, and so on. So one thing to think about is that even though overall we've seen downward trend in COVID cases, and hopefully, right, it largely is gone in the next few months, although, you know, life happens while you're making plans. I don't think any of us have a good sense of where things might be going from here, but even in a world where we don't necessarily have COVID-19 actively, I think that this past year and a half has really changed many of the ways that work happens. In fact, a lot of companies and businesses are just simply offering more jobs remotely. That might be in order to keep employees who have enjoyed working remotely and want to continue to do so, navigating things such as childcare, commute, and some of the labor involved with that. Or for a lot of companies and businesses, it's realizing that, hey, there's a lot of stuff that we can do remotely that we used to do face-to-face in the past, such as a lot more meetings that are now offered through things like Zoom that in the past would involve people working together. So even if COVID is gone, right, we still have a big change in some of the ways that we're communicating and using a lot more online settings for communication. It's really important for us as we prepare about and think about the rest of our lives, how that has changed and made our use of online communication even more important. As we've talked about in the class, right, online communication brings about a lot of challenges, such as the lack of nonverbal cues. You might remember, nonverbal communication is about 93% or up to 93% of the communication we do. Our expressions, our gestures, and so on. So it's a lot easier for us to have our online communication be harder to understand or could give the wrong message. So for instance, it's more important now than ever to know how to make a good and professional email and learn how to use online settings that are appropriate for the situation. We also have a challenge with exposure, right? So a lot of times using something like a Zoom camera, as many of you might have felt last year, is challenging because you're basically giving people a window into your life. Now you might use background or filter to help show the parts of yourself that you're comfortable with, but in the same way, you're dealing with the challenge of trying to share a version of yourself online that you might not have to share if you were coming to class. So, for instance, right, my partner and I were in this tiny apartment when COVID was pretty bad, and we had this one office that we were rotating between, and also there were a lot of pets, including a cat, that would suddenly go across the screen. And so we'd have to deal with that element of our personal lives and the way it impacted our meetings. You might have dealt with something similar in your own life. So that can be one concern. There's also less kind of casual conversation that happens too, right? If you're working and you just have an office or space, there's a lot of common areas where people will just chat, or somebody might come over and go to your office and say hello. But we don't have that same level of communication that happens casually because maybe you send an email or use the chat, but there's less of that regular engagement. But there's also more flexibility in the styles and ways that we choose to communicate too. Our ability to send emails, to more create our own type of schedule, can be a really helpful thing in the ways that we might engage in the workplace. So, one of the key ideas here and kind of the practical feedback that I would give to you about how you can use some of these ideas that we're talking about today is to think about the role of how we engage professionally in the workplace. Now, this idea of professionalism is a challenging one because I think in many ways professional communication kind of deals with a lot of challenges in race, ethnicity, gender, and so on, right? What does it mean to be professional? In fact, in the United States, right, there's at times been racist and problematic history surrounding, for instance, the types of hairstyles that are considered acceptable at work. And so our definition of professionalism has shifted to try to be more inclusive. Gendered elements, right, such as clothing and participation at work are also things that have shifted and tried to change over time. So, right, professionalism can oftentimes be a gatekeeper including folks with disabilities who, if their disability is visible or known, might be told not being professional, right? But there, again, have been some shifts to try to create a more inclusive understanding of what professionalism is and what that means. As a side note, right, the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability, tries to provide reasonable accommodation, but a lot of companies and businesses like to give loopholes. One such loophole is that if you've ever applied for a job or internship and you've seen that the job requires and says you have to lift at least 30 pounds, that's oftentimes used as a way to prevent folks with particular disabilities from applying or being qualified for the job, even if they never had to lift 30 pounds in their entire job. So if you've ever seen in a job application that that's there and you're wondering why, it's oftentimes used, unfortunately, as a loophole. So again, that points to the idea that professionalism and inclusion is not something that's neutral, right? It's something that we have to constantly think about and the ways that it impacts certain people over time. Another challenge, of course, and one that some of you might have experienced in this past year and a half, have been impacts on things like mental health, right? And there have been a lot of barriers and challenges that have required us to rethink what professionalism means. But in general, right, it gets at the idea of a profession or kind of an occupation or job that is important to you, right? It involves knowledge, training, or practical experience. So professionalism is not just kind of a white-collar job, but it can cover an entire range of areas that you feel like you have a good sense of and pursue for your lives. So professionalism, then, is the sort of combination of traits that mean that you're acting appropriately for the situation or job that you're a part of. You might be thinking about this idea of workplace culture or situation, right? One of the key ideas from this class is the idea that our communication is contextual. The context or situation in which we're communicating is important. We have to think about the needs of other people and act in a way that's supportive for those. So professionalism gets at the idea of how we engage with others respectfully. One of the key examples here, right, is the use of something like email in a professional way. So kind of to give you a quick pointer about how you might do that. Typically, you would have a clear subject. In fact, there are a lot of emails that might be sent without a subject line. So try to have a subject that's pretty focused to whatever you want to talk about. Including a salutation in the beginning is an appropriate way to start an email. So, you know, hello, you might just include somebody's name or title, right? I think including kind of some type of general greeting, for instance, I hope this message finds you well, is a good way to start. Having clear content. If you're asking for something, like in this email, it's asking for vacation hours, right? Posing that request in a clear way, offering some type of reassurance where you say, you know, I appreciate the time and effort that you're doing. You know, I'm open to other options if that doesn't work. Having kind of an end line like best, thanks, and so on, and then concluding with your signature is one way to do that. Through EOU or Google Mail, right, you can include custom signature. Some of you have already built that in, but a custom signature easily prevents you from having to type that end of your email over and over again. So, you know, it's something to practice. If you haven't already composed emails in that way, maybe the next time that you need to contact an instructor for a course, you can use that format as a way to structure your message and ensure that you're engaging respectfully with other people, right? And one thing to think about too, depending on the job or situation, is timing. And knowing that, you know, you might choose to leave an email that you're about to send at 11 o'clock at night to 9 o'clock the next day to respect the person's time. Again, those might be some of the norms or traits that we would see in our communication through email. So if you've seen The Office, right, you've probably seen a lot of examples of unethical communication. The challenge of ethics in communication is a big one because in the workplace, oftentimes we might see issues of power, influence, and control much more severe than we might otherwise. This is oftentimes because somebody occupies a role as a supervisor or a role as somebody with experience, they might wield and use power in different ways. And workplaces might have a sort of competition over scarce resources that can pose some unique challenges too. So to kind of show you a silly example of some of the ways that communication is not necessarily ethical, I really enjoy the TV show Parks and Recreation. There's a fun little clip that's the characters on the show, and there's an argument about who broke a coffee maker.
So, who broke it? I'm not mad, I just want to know.
I did. I broke it.
No, you didn't. Tom?
Don't look at me. Look at Ben.
What? I didn't break it.
Huh, that's weird. How'd you even know it was broken?
Because it's sitting right in front of us and it's broken.
Suspicious.
No, it's not.
If it matters. Probably not, but April was the last one to use it.
Liar, I don't even drink that crap.
Oh, really? Then what were you doing by the coffee cart
I
earlier?
used the wooden stir and put it back on the cuticles. Everyone knows that. Jerry.
Okay, let's not fight. I broke it. Let me pay for it, Ron.
No. Who broke it?
Ron, Don has been awfully quiet.
Really?
Yeah, really.
I broke it. It burned my hand, so I punched it. I predict 10 minutes from now, they'll be at each other's throats with war paint on their faces and a pig head on a stick.
So kind of silly, but I think a fun way of thinking about some of the ways that unethical behavior happens in the workplace. And so, right, there's a lot of examples of some of these things that we can see at play here. Obviously, the use of deception. Ron is choosing to pit everybody against each other and create that kind of unethical scenario. But there's a lot of different examples that we might see here of challenges in ethical communication, right? So coercive might be using power in order to manipulate or hurt somebody else. So maybe it's a supervisor coming in and saying, hey, you wouldn't mind doing this additional work, would you? Or coming in to do overtime. So that could be one way that power is wielded. Destructive, right, is designed to hurt. So Ron is kind of doing some destructive communication here, trying to get some of the members against each other in that group. Deceptive might be using indirect communication or lying, right, as a way of trying to get more leverage. For instance, saying, hey, I got a job somewhere else. Can you give me a raise? Might be deceptive communication. Intrusive, right, is invading on somebody's privacy. So, for instance, it might be a supervisor not setting appropriate boundaries and giving you a call at a time outside of what might be good or appropriate hours. Secretive communication is designed to conceal. One really major example of secretive communication is that for a lot of jobs, there's not necessarily an open discussion about how much people are paid, right? That's a problem that we've noticed and talked about in terms of celebrities and pay for acting. But one tactic that employers might choose is to not disclose how much their employees are paid so that employees don't talk about that, or they're not aware if there are situations where employees are paid in amounts that are not equal, right? For instance, in some acting and performance jobs, there would be that type of culture, and then women might realize, wow, now that I know how much my male co-star is paid, which is more, then I'm really concerned about this type of culture. So exploitative, right, might be designed to expose or to use somebody's work, again, requiring somebody to work outside of their regular hours for free. So the key idea here is this role of ethics, of doing the right thing or doing what's sort of just or supportive of the time. So if you ever, or you find yourself currently in a kind of leadership capacity, whether you're an RA or you're working with other students, such as middle or high school students, right? You might be thinking about how to engage ethically and avoid these traits in terms of respecting people's time, being open, and so on. One of the kind of challenging areas of communication in the workplace is the role of microaggressions, right? So microaggressions are things that are talked about a little bit in some courses, but I think are important for us when we're thinking about interpersonal communication because it's a major way where social differences get a lot more exacerbated. Microaggressions, one way of thinking about those is the idea of death by 1,000 cuts, right? For the average person who might not be familiar, maybe a question or thought or idea is presented that might be offensive or hurtful. And so for somebody that doesn't come from a particular social or political or racial background, right, they might think, what's the big deal? But the challenge is that because they happen so often, microaggressions really start to deteriorate and statistically have been shown to hurt quality of work, have been shown to hurt people's mental health, their well-being, and so on. So it's the fact that they're things that are constantly felt or expressed that makes these things challenges for engaging ethically. For instance, a nurse, can you find me a doctor, right? Implying that women could not occupy a role as a doctor. Do you speak English, right? For people that are not white, implying that they don't necessarily speak English, including as a first language, could be one major issue. And there are any doctors from America here would be an example of, again, employing a kind of ethnocentric frame. Not recognizing, right, that what it might mean to be American could cover a lot of different grounds. So that also plays into the role of bias, right, of assumptions about who is a good worker, who is good to work with or work together with, and so on, and trying to avoid those. Using language and terminology that might be explicitly racist or sexist is something to avoid, right? In fact, if you've seen shows like The Office, the poor handling of things like racist and sexist language is at times used for humor. And then ethnocentrism, right? The belief that somebody's own culture and identity is better than another culture is a challenge to try to work through in terms of being more inclusive to ideas, perspectives, thoughts, and so on. So I wanted to show you a brief video that goes over some additional specifics about the challenges of microaggressions in society.
And safer learning environment.
You did really well in the skills checkoff today. I was pleasantly surprised.
Since I was a kid, I've always known I've wanted to do this.
Consider a time you've witnessed an interaction that left you feeling uncomfortable because it implied that someone or a group wasn't capable or expected to be successful. This interaction is called a microaggression. Microaggression is a term used to describe remarks or actions that imply negative associations and insults toward an individual or group. These are often directed at members of historically marginalized groups. People are often unaware that the impact of their words and actions can have such harmful consequences. This video is part one of a two-part series designed to empower you to notice and interrupt microaggressions. Every microaggression students and staff experience adds to their load. One unintentional comment may seem insignificant, but these comments and experiences can get very heavy. By creating a better understanding of microaggressions and how to stop them, WTCS faculty, staff, and students will create a more inclusive and safer learning environment for all.
Right, so this is part of a school initiative toward acknowledging and dealing with issues of microaggressions. I know that universities like EOU have also tried to put out some similar strategies of dealing with the ways that those things happen. Again, one of the ways that those come up are when they are specific to a group or population, right? And implying somebody's value or identity on those bases. So an example, right, going back for a lot of examples is saying, wow, you know, based on your gender, you surprised me at how well you did this activity. So that could be an example of how microaggressions come into play. And those can have negative social and psychological consequences. So they're challenges to try to avoid. So some of the ways that we can think about the role of culture, identity, and inclusion in the workplace include a lot of different elements. One of the biggest ones is dealing with the issue of bias, right? Self-reflexivity is the idea that we can learn and we can fall forward and use the mistakes that we've made as a way to get better. To stay open and empathic would mean to create a kind of environment where people were comfortable with sharing about their concerns and feeling like they were able to bring those concerns to the table and have them taken seriously. For instance, EOU has the Title IX office, which helps to avoid discrimination on the basis of sex or gender identity. And so that office helps to avoid and prevent situations like that. Bringing curiosity to the table means showing an openness to understanding and engaging with the perspectives of outside groups. letting go of an urge to fix every problem is a big idea because if we choose to fix or solve an issue the minute that it comes up, then maybe for members of the group there isn't much time to understand and try to figure out what the problem is and the feelings or challenges that people are dealing with. And then collaboration can be a really important element too, where you can better understand some of the concerns or issues that might come about in a particular group or context. There's also the idea of the error method, which can be a really helpful way of dealing with negative situations that might happen at work. One of the ideas here is empathy, right, of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. If, for instance, you're in a situation where a coworker is expressing that a racial slur was said against them, implementing responsibility, right, that can be an important element of an apology or forgiveness, acknowledging the role that you might have played in that negative encounter. Offering a reason or explaining to that person how that might have happened. At times, something like an excuse could be seen not as a great thing, but offering a reason. For instance, I came from a less informed perspective. This was a term that was used growing up, but I've learned not to use in the same way. And then offering a reassurance might be helping that person to better understand how you would avoid that issue going on again in the future. Right? So for instance, the use of the R word to describe folks with disabilities is a term that has been used culturally a lot, but is one that we've tried to move away from. And using something like that might be an example of using this method to provide more inclusive language choices. So Ken Blanchard proposes this idea of a situational leadership model. The situational leadership model essentially has, again, a 2x2 quadrant that describes different ways that a supervisor or manager or somebody in a leadership position at work could choose to engage with their employees. So as you think about situations where you might be in a leadership position, you might be thinking about the approach that you would take towards supporting and engaging with the people that you work with on a regular basis. So one of the spectrums here, right, is the idea of leadership-directed behavior. To what degree is a leader in a group essentially calling the shots or creating organization among members of the group? And then the other spectrum here is how supportive the leader is to the needs or concerns that might come about in the group members themselves. So in other words, if you have somebody as a leader, such as a sports coach, right, who is both really active in directing, but also really active in supporting the needs of groups, you might have this coaching model here on the top right. As a coach, you are taking an active role, and you are kind of calling the shots, but you're doing so in a way that attempts to provide a lot of support and encouragement toward the people that you'd be working with. If you are not necessarily providing a lot of direct leadership, but you are providing a lot of guidance in terms of social support, the supporting role on the top left would be a way that you might choose to interact. So the supportive role means that you would be providing emotional support, you'd be directing toward resources, but you would allow the person to be pretty independent and create, for instance, their own hours. So the supporting role doesn't necessarily guide the employees as much, but it is meant to ensure that they have the help that they need. Under a directing role, right, the leader is calling the shots, but the employees are not necessarily getting a lot of social support or help. A really good example of this, right, would be a supervisor saying, do this, get this on my desk by 5, and then they leave. So under that type of model, it might be more difficult to feel like you have the resources that let you succeed. And then delegating is a situation where the leader doesn't provide a whole lot of direction nor support. So one way of saying this might be, hey, we need to get these assignments done by the end of the week. Go figure it out. And under this type of model, it might be the workers themselves that form different groups in order to accomplish the task. So under this type of delegating model, oftentimes the labor would fall upon employees to figure out how to solve an issue. Another idea, and one that you might be thinking about if you're talking to somebody like a coach or someone that you have a sort of professional relationship with, is the leader-manager exchange theory. Again, this will be available after class for you to use to better think about this approach. But it's the idea that we have three major stages in our relationships with people that we work with. One being a stranger stage, an acquaintance stage, or partner stage. So, for instance, maybe you're getting to know your supervisor or getting to know your coach and you don't know them very well. You're in the stranger stage where there's a creation of a partnership or relationship. There's immediate reciprocity, that is, you and that person are communicating very directly to set up the ground rules. The roles that you and that person might have are very scripted or well-defined. There's not a lot of trust, and maybe the exchanges are fairly direct. For instance, your emails and your correspondence, because you can't get into a whole lot of details or disclosure yet. And so you're generally focused on your own interest in working with that person. So as you start to develop a closer relationship, for instance, with your supervisor or your coach, you'll notice that some of the ways that your goals shift reflect that better relationship. For instance, you have greater trust, your communication is higher quality, the roles that you have with that person are a little bit more specialized and negotiated, and you start to focus more on the interest of the group or team as a whole. You might think back to social penetration theory, and one of the major ideas here, right, is that early on in a relationship, we have this one-to-one exchange with other people. How are you doing today? Good, how are you? And there's this very careful, like, saying the same amount as the other person, disclosing the same amount as the other person, very tit for tat in the type of communication that you do. But as you get to know somebody better, you're more comfortable with one-sided communication, right? Somebody's having a bad day, they vent to you, and there's a space for that person just to talk. And so we similarly see that as we get to know and work better with our employees. There's also different styles that you as a worker, you as a student, might be taking in terms of how you're engaging in more professional or workplace-oriented situations, right? So this is based on the amount of support that you would receive from a supervisor or coach, and then the level of challenge that you might have toward authority or toward that group as a whole. So if you don't have a lot of support from a supervisor and you don't really challenge the group or organization, you're a resource. So for instance, maybe you're an alum at a school, you come back and say, hey, I'd love to provide some volunteer work and talk to our soccer team. That might be a resource. You're making yourself available as somebody to reach out to. An implementer, right, is somebody that is not really challenging the supervisor or leader, but is instead receiving a lot of support to help make that happen. So for instance, an implementer is somebody who really makes sure that they're getting the tasks done and that they're following along with directions. Somebody who is individualist, who doesn't get a lot of support from a supervisor, but might do a lot to directly challenge an authority figure, right? And challenge is not necessarily bad. Challenge oftentimes means that you're going about it in your own path. So for instance, maybe you're asked to regularly complete your own training and practice. Under an individualist perspective, maybe you're going to the gym and you create a schedule of 3 or 4 times a week to get your practice and training in on your own. And then a partner is somebody that's both very individual focused, right, but also somebody that has a lot of support. So a partner, you might think about something like a law firm, right? A partner is somebody that is able to contribute to and add to the discussion. So in this way, a challenger who also has support is somebody that is sought for their opinions on the topic and is really seen as a major source of input. Again, these models help us to understand some of the dynamics of why communication in the workplace plays out and the role of power in some of those exchanges. So what I'd like you to do now is take some time to write or type out on your own. And what I'd like you to do is to consider a career field. And again, I know that you're probably in a place where you're still trying to figure out where you might like to go from here. Or maybe you're in a place where you already have professional work or you've done professional work in the past. So consider a career field that might be one that you're interested in. Maybe you're really into journalism, Or maybe you'd like to be involved in sports medicine. Or maybe you'd like to be involved in coaching, right? Think about a field that you're interested in or have already kind of dipped your toes into. In your own words, and based on what we talked about so far today, I want you to think about what it would mean to be professional in this field. So what does it mean to be a professional? Secondarily, what would it mean to communicate ethically in your field, given kind of the do's and don'ts that we talked about for today? And then how might you engage in other words, respond to microaggressions in that field too? So I'll give you some time to think about this. Okay, so I did a little bit of wandering around to hear some of the things that you shared, right? For some of you, you might be coming in with similar career perspectives or interests, things like athletic training, or you might find that they're pretty different, but regardless, right, the definition of what it would mean to be professional is kind of this Venn diagram, right, where you have maybe things unique to your profession, like providing mentoring or training, but also some shared ideas. For instance, offering things like respect, being available as a resource might be ways universally, if you're working with other people in a lot of different ways, that you might be professional or ethical in how you communicate, right? So communication ethically both involves being open and supportive, but it also involves supporting things like boundaries. Microaggressions, of course, can be a challenge, particularly some people brought up, like the roles of things like gendered coaching and athletics. That can be a challenge for us to continue to deal with, is while a microaggression, right, or an insult or question might not seem like a big deal to us, we never know the ways that our words could hurt or impact other people. It's important to be open to and hear the emotional response that other people might have to what we say and do. So to wrap up for today, we talked about some of the ways that communication in work and applied contexts have changed over the last several years. The ways that we can engage in respect and thoughtful leadership styles and listening are also really important elements to look at too. So for next class, we'll talk about the dark side of interpersonal communication and some of the negative patterns of relationships. As a reminder, continue to work on your final essay. Please complete instructor evaluations if you haven't done so already. And be safe and stay warm as we navigate the snow. Have a great rest of your day. Please pass forward your attendance for today, and I'll see you again on Wednesday.